Hey there, I'm Newman, and today we're going to take a look at how scopes work in JavaScript. I'm going to go over what scope is, the difference between global and local scope, how we can create new scopes, and just in general how scopes work. So let's get right into it. When it comes down to it, scope is basically the set of rules that determines where a variable can be accessed from and also where it can't be accessed from. You can kind of think of scope as a series of bubbles, and variables can be defined and called within these bubbles. But once you move outside of the bubble, then you can no longer access those variables. So in a sense, these bubbles, these scopes, are hiding variables from the rest of the program. This is especially useful in large and complicated programs where you might use the same variable name twice, but have different purposes for it, and then they can end up overriding each other and causing a whole bunch of problems. So how do we create a scope or a bubble for us to declare variables in? Well, there's actually a couple of ways to do it. The first way is by defining a function, creating a function. And the second way is by creating a block statement. A block statement is pretty much any statement that has curly braces following after it. These are your if statements, for loops, while loops. You get the point. There's some exceptions as to whether these block statements actually create a new scope, and we'll get into that later. But for now, let's create a new scope by defining a function. So I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to name it foo. And inside of that function, I'm going to declare a variable, and I'm going to set it equal to 1. Now, if I try to access this variable from inside the function by logging it out here, and then running the function, we'll have no problem accessing this variable a because it's within the scope of this function, which is between the two curly braces. If I try to access this variable from outside of the function, what happens is we actually get a reference error. And the reason for that is when we define a new scope, anything inside of it pretty much becomes hidden from outside of it. So when we're trying to access this variable a, JavaScript can't actually find the variable because it's hidden from within this scope. What we've essentially done here is create a local scope. There's also a global scope, which is a scope that covers the entire document, and variables defined globally can actually be accessed from anywhere in the document. And the way to declare a global variable is just by declaring a variable normally, as long as it's not in a function or a block statement. So if I create a b variable and I set it equal to 2, I've basically just created a global variable. One way to imagine it is to think of curly braces opening and closing in the beginning and the end of the document. So it's like this is one big bubble, and this is the global scope. And then when we make functions or block statements, we're creating local scopes from within the global scope. And when we create these local scopes, the variables defined within them can only be accessed from inside of them. Another important thing to know is that we can actually nest scopes within each other. If we take a look at this program, I have a function foo, and within that function, I have another one called bar. And inside bar, we're logging out a. When it comes to nesting scopes, child scopes are always able to access their parent scopes. So when we log out a here, since bar is a child of foo, it's going to have access to the variable a, and it's going to be able to log it out. So when we run this program, it's going to execute foo, which is going to declare a and assign it equal to 1. and then it's going to execute bar, and it's going to log out A, which will make it log out 1. Once again, if I try to access this A variable from outside of its scope, from out in the global area here, I'm not going to be able to access it. But child scopes can always access the variables in their parents. When you try to access a variable inside of your program, for example right here, where I'm trying to log out the variable A, what happens is JavaScript first checks the local scope that it's in, and since it can't find it here, it moves out to the parent scope. Once it gets to the parent scope, it finds A is defined here and assigned 1. So it takes that number, puts it into A, and logs into the console. You can see that I have A defined here globally, but it doesn't take that value because the scope lookup will stop at its first match. So it starts at the local scope here, where it's defined, or where it's being called from. And since it can't find it here, it moves up to the parent. And then when it finds it in the parent, it ignores the fact that it's defined globally. It doesn't even get there. And it takes this value and it outputs it to the console for us. So far, I've been using functions to define new scopes. And I told you earlier that we can actually use block statements to create new scopes as well. But this isn't always the case. If I create an if statement, and I'm going to set its condition to true so that it runs regardless, I can define a variable in here, and I'll set it equal to 1. And like earlier, I'm going to try to access this variable from outside of the function, outside of the block statement, sorry. And when I run it, I don't actually get a reference error. I get 1 logged into the console. Here, I'll clear it from last time so it comes obvious. And the reason for that is when we declare a variable using var, it actually doesn't create a new scope inside of block statements. Inside of functions, it'll create a new scope. But when we use var inside of a block statement, it actually doesn't create a new scope. It's as if we didn't even have the if statement here and we declared it globally like that. The way we can make block statements create new scopes is by defining variables with let or const. So when I have let a equals 1 instead of var a, and I try to run and access a from outside of this block, what happens is we get, you guessed it, a reference error. This also applies to const. And this is one of the differences between the let and const way of declaring a variable and var. So always keep that in mind. If you use var inside of a block statement, it's not going to get attached to the scope, but if you use let or const, it will. So that's it for this video. To sum up, scope can be thought of as a bubble, and inside that bubble, variables can be declared. And when you try to access variables from outside of that bubble, you're going to get a reference error. But when you try to access variables from within the bubble or from within nested bubbles or scopes, you'll be able to access variables no problem. When you create scopes with functions, you can define variables any way you like, and they'll be bound to that scope. But when it comes to block scopes, your if statements, for loops, while loops, make sure that you define your variables with let or const if you're expecting them to be tied to the scope of those blocks. That's all for this video. I hope you guys learned something new. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.